Hi, this is Todd Geist with Geist Interactive, and today I'd like to talk about Selector Connector. This is a collaboration between Jason Young and John Sindler at Seedcode and myself. We've been kicking around this idea for a number of years, and recently it's kind of gelled together and become something we think is pretty interesting. And it was something we were talking about at Pause on Air last month in Portland, and we were calling it universal context was one of the terms we used to describe it. Basically, it's a relationship graph pattern which makes everything available from wherever you happen to be on the graph, or at least in all the important places on your graph. It turns out that universal context is not a great name, so we've changed the name. We're now calling it Selector Connector. Hopefully those reasons will become obvious as we go through this little presentation. But first of all, why? What do we care about all this stuff for? Context is a double-edged sword in FileMaker. It is definitely the thing that makes FileMaker relatively easy to use, but it is also the thing that makes some things in FileMaker very difficult. And it basically comes down to we sometimes need access to parts of the graph that we're not directly connected to, and that turns out to be a problem. It makes things more difficult. Makes it so that we have to have lots of duplicate code to do the same things spread throughout our system. So it's kind of painful. So let's take an example of where that comes up. So this is sort of a standard anchor buoy type graph that many of you have probably seen, where on the left-hand side you'll see we have invoices, an invoice data table, and a customers table. And then they're connected to their buoys as they're flowing off to the right. And those buoys are for accessing data or displaying data on layouts or getting to data from scripts that are running on those anchor tables on the left. Now this is fine, it's worked, and people have been using this model for many, many years now. But if we look, we have a couple of issues here. You'll notice in the very top there's a green table occurrence called invoice graphics. And that is a table occurrence to an instance of my graphics table, and it's connected to my invoices TO, so I have to call it invoice graphics. And it contains just all the graphics images that I want to use in my solution. And if I want to use it with my invoices table, then I'm going to need to have a connection, and it's connected with a cross join, you can see there, to the invoices graphics table. And so that makes it so that anything, if I'm on invoices, I can get to graphics that are in my invoices graphics table. TO, that works fine. But if I want those same graphics in customers, you can see down the bottom of the screen, I have essentially a duplicate of the graphics table. It's another instance of the graphics table called customer graphics. And so anywhere that I want to use those graphics tables, anywhere I want to use those graphics in my solution, I'm going to need to have a connection to the anchor on the left. So that, if you have a complex system, you end up with many, many copies of your graphics TO. And that's kind of painful. Another way in which this shows up, maybe a little more complicated, is if you notice at the top, we have a blue TO called Invoice Selected Customer. And so that's there because at some point with my scripts or with my relationship, I want to be able, or with my layouts that are based on invoices, I would like to be able to select a given customer. Maybe I want to add that customer to this invoice and say this invoice belongs to this customer. But in order to do that, I want to first select that customer and display it in some interface and then do something with it. So the way that we normally do that is we will have a global field in the invoices TO, and we'll populate that with a customer key, and then we'll create that relationship to the invoices selected customer table occurrence, and then I've got access to that selected customer. Again, that works fine, but what if I now want that somewhere else in my system? Maybe I've got purchase orders in the system, and I need to do the same thing. Well, now I'm going to have a duplicate TO for invoice selected customer. I'll have to have purchase order selected customer and return selected customer. Everywhere I need it, I have to create a copy of it. So that's sort of the double-edged sword of context, is that if we want to get access to things like graphics or to selectors and other types of utility type table occurrences, we're going to need to create copies of those all throughout our graph, and that gets to be a nightmare. So this is that same graph using Selector Connector as the graph architecture. And what you can see here is we only have one copy of the graphics TO up at the top, and it is connected to my connector TO, and that connector connects all of the heads in the anchor buoy together. So the good news is that invoices still has access to graphics, and customers also has access to graphics now, going through the connector up to that graphics TO. We get the same thing with the selector. We have a selector table occurrence, which is connected to connector, which means that I can select a customer from invoices, or I can select a customer from invoices data, or from anywhere else in my graph that is connected to connector. So these guys, connector is connected to everything through cross joins, and there's a single record in connector and a single record in the selector table, and that basically makes anything that I want to hang off of connector available to any of what used to be my anchors in my anchor buoy model: invoices, data, and customers. So that is really what we're talking about with selector connector. A single record TO that has nothing but globals in it, and that's important. Both of these guys have nothing but globals in it, and they connect everything. So connector sits in the middle, everything connects to it, and that gives us access to everything from anywhere in our graph that we care about. And selector is another single record TO that has nothing but globals in it, and it is used just for selecting records. It can also be used for creating records and deleting records, and I'll show some of that and some of that how that's done in some of the examples that come later. So sort of a recap there. We've renamed this to selector connector because it's really two separate concepts. We have a connector TO which connects everything, and we have a selector TO which selects everything. These concepts work really well together and give you a very powerful pattern. It's very flexible, but they could be used separately. You wouldn't need to use selector to use connector and make use of that, or vice versa. So these are separately the selector model and the connector model, and together we call them selector connector. All right, and just to be clear, we're not replacing anchor buoy. Now some people will balk at the idea of connecting the anchors. It's kind of like in that old Ghostbusters movie, Don't Cross the Streams. Some people will really not like having all their anchors connected to one thing, and I get that, but overall it's a pretty darn good trade-off, and it ends up being very powerful. So you quickly, at least we've found that that minor inconvenience is quickly overcome by all the power and flexibility you get in the model. It doesn't replace the session model. In fact, you can use a session model along with this, and it doesn't, again, it doesn't replace anchor buoy. You can use anchor buoy along with it. And it also is not really about separation model. The separation model has to do with putting your data in a separate file. And what we're talking about here is the table occurrences and the table occurrence group that you use to create your user interface and some of your scripted logic. It's really not about the table occurrences that you would set up for your data file, for example. But again, this works just fine with the separation model. Separation model plays very nicely with it. So what we get if we accept this single record connector in the middle, we get a lot of cool things, and I'm going to talk about some in specifics and sort of some of the goals that we had in setting out to build this thing. And then also what we discovered is once we had this connector in place, a lot of things that used to be difficult got very, very simple. And that really excited us, because that's a sign that you're onto something. If you start building some new architecture and all of a sudden things get easier, you kind of know you're on the right track. So we're going to talk about some of the things that got easier when we accepted the connector as the center of our universe, so to speak. All right, so let's take a look at the demos. All right, so this is the demo file that we're going to be looking at, and it's the one that's available along with this movie in post. It has, well, everything you see here is going to be in that file. This is the demo file. We've extracted this out of actual, real customer files because we couldn't give those away. So, so anyway, you can get this, tear it apart, have fun with it, do whatever you like. But let's have a quick intro to it before we get into the first of the things that gets easier when we have our selector connector model in place. So just pretty simple: items, customers, orders. We have this kind of nice thing going on here. We have a bunch of features which I'm going to get into, and we can look at how easy they became when we had connector in place. All right, the first one we're going to talk about is graphics. So here at the top in this screen we have a container field, and it is in our graphics table occurrence, and it is available on all of the layouts that we have here: items, customers, and orders. It's all the same field, and it is all just on the layout, and that works just fine because we have our connector set up here. So here are the table occurrences that we're looking at. These are where the layouts are built. On the home screen is built on the session TO. We have orders, items, and customers. So those are the layouts that we're looking at. Connector connects all those guys like we looked at before. And then connected to connector is graphics. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. So you can see graphics is up here in the top, and all of my other tables are connected to graphics through connector. So that means that any layouts that I have based on orders, items, customers, or sessions has access to graphics. I don't have to do anything special to load my graphics into globals or any other tricks that we've done in the past to make our graphic logos and things like that, arrows, what have you, available to any layout in my system. All I have to do is just build this off of connector. So connector links them together, and it makes graphics super, super simple. All right, so I want to show, I've got master detail in here, and if you've been watching my website lately, you've seen a nice long video on that and how that works, the new version of master detail 2.0, and that is also integrated into this system. You can see it here. It's on every one of our screens, actually. We get it on every one. That's this middle portal here. And master detail is really cool. And just as a brief look back at how that's done and how it looks on the graph, in the master detail file, it ships with one table, and we have a connection from that table to our master details rows table. Now you can imagine that if I didn't have selector connector in place, in every table that I wanted to use a master detail pattern on, I would have to have a connection to master detail rows. So I would have to have duplicates of master detail rows all throughout my system, and that would make all of my layouts and all the code associated with that much, much, much more complicated. But once I have a connector in place, I can do it in a different way. So we still have master detail, but here it is. So again, here are the TOs that are associated with my layouts. So there's orders, and there's items and customers, and then master detail is connected through connector. I go through a master details utility table to master detail rows. So now, again, every one of these TOs where my layouts are based has access to master detail, and I only need one copy of them, and it works just fine. So this works on every layout in my system because it all connects up from whatever layout I happen to be on. It goes up to connector and then goes up to master detail rows. Now, another thing to point out here on the graph is I've used this second table occurrence here, master detail, in between my layout TOs and my master detail rows here. And the reason I'm doing that is because I needed a global field to make master detail work, and I decided to put that in its own table, its own utility table, as opposed to having to put it into every one of these tables, which I would normally have to do if I followed the original model. We would have to have a global field in each one of these connected to master detail rows. But in this case, I have a special TO. It really only has two fields, an XJoin and a found count, and that's it. And that's all it takes to hook up to master detail. And now that found count, I only need one of them. It's in my system. It's available from anywhere in the system because it goes through connector. And master detail, the feature, is encapsulated in these two TOs right here. So if I wanted to get rid of master detail, I just have to delete those, and my graph no longer has anything to do with master detail. And then I would have to go to my scripts folder and delete the master detail scripts folder that's in there, and I would remove completely master detail from my system, which is really nice. So master detail is encapsulated in its own easy to find and piece out parts of the graph. Okay, so next demo. So menu. So I have this menu over here, and this is really pretty simple, and it's simple again because of connector. So let's take a look at how it shows up on the graph. We have, I realize it's kind of hard when I'm scrolling back and forth between these, but let me try to bring this together. So here are our orders. Here are our layout TOs again, down here. These are what our layouts are built on. We go up through connector, and we have a main menu. Let's bring it down here so we can see it with the rest of these guys. So we have a main menu table occurrence with a cross join. So now every one of these guys just needs a portal to main menu, and we get this nice portal over here that works just fine. So there is our main menu portal, and you can imagine if you wanted to add some logic to this, it'd be pretty simple. Like let's say you only wanted to display certain records on the menu to certain people. Well, you could simply just add a filter portal calculation here that would show only certain menu items to certain people at certain times. And that's all that you would need to do to display your menu. And then we have one script which runs when you click on the menu, and that is it. Right? There's nothing, it just kind of falls out because I have connector. So connector gives me access to any of my utility tables, one of which is main menu. Main menu has 4 records in it. All those records are displayed through a cross join, and that's it. And I can sort it. I can add all kinds of logic to that just based on the relationship there, either filtering the portal or sorting the portal or sorting the relationship itself. I don't really have to do much, and I get this kind of main menu thing for free. All right. Notice up in the top we have this back and forth menu nav thing, history navigation. And cool thing to notice is I'm actually navigating back through records as well as layouts, which is really pretty neat. The only way to get back to a record by its ID without destroying the found set is by using a go to related record. And if the record is in the found set and you use go to related record to get there, it will just pick it out and you'll navigate to it. If it's not in the found set, you will get find all. But in this case, you can see that it works pretty well, right? I can change a record, and then I can nav back to those records. So the trick is we need a way to do go to related records, sort of, very easily, and we have it entirely built into the graph here. So I'm going to bring the selector in, which we haven't talked about yet, I don't believe. So this is selector, and in this case, we're going to use selector to navigate to a specific record and get to where we need to go. So if you can imagine, I'm on orders, and I click the back button, and in the back history, where I wanted to go was something based on, say, customers, and had a record for a specific customer ID. What I would need to do is set the customer ID with that ID from the history that I'm tracking, and then I do go to related record, which would go through connector, through selector to the selected customer, and then using the option in go to related record using a different layout, I can actually navigate to the customer record over here on one of its layouts. So let's look at that in the script because that can be a little bit confusing. But this is really just using go to related record, and that is right here in our back and forth module. We have a branching script. So for every table occurrence, every table that I want to go back to that's in my system, I have a branch, and I have a go to related record script step in there for each branch. And the reason you need that is because there's no way to go to related record using any kind of indirection. It's sort of hard-coded. We need a branching script to do it. But for example, so if I am on a TO based on item, then I have to go to related record selected item, and then I use a layout number by calculation to get back to the item layout that I wanted to be on. Layout number by calculation. So that's the number that's stored in history. And so if we look at the data, let's see, we'll go to data viewer. We can look at where's our history. Let's pull that over. So here's our history. So here's forward. So you can see it has the layout number, the table occurrence, and the record ID. And so that's all we need to navigate back to that. And we can do that from anywhere in our system, again, because of the magic of Selector Connector. We have selector gives us the infrastructure to use a go-to-related record to any of our tables that we care to in our system. And connector gives us the ability to use that feature from anywhere, any of the layouts and scripts that are in our system down here. So that is a look at back and forth with selector. Oh yes, but one more thing. So the other thing about that is, so here's back and forth. We have a separate TO for back and forth. And it is connected to connector, of course, so it can be accessible from anywhere. And that table, back and forth, is a utility table that contains all of the graphics and unstored calculations that I want to use as part of that system. So where am I using an unstored calculation? Well, these back and forward arrows that show up are unstored calcs based on the containers, the arrows that are stored here in the containers, in this arrow container field, and the state of the history. So if there's no history, then the back shows a different version of that icon than if there is. And because those are unstored and they're not global, normally if I didn't have that connected to connector, if this back and forth was unconnected, if I didn't have a cross join there, then I wouldn't be able to display those arrows on any layouts based on this guy down here. So having back and forth connected to connector makes this calculation, these fields, available. Whoops, let's get to the specify the fields there. Has those guys available anywhere in the system where I'm building my user interface. So that is back and forth, which just gets a lot easier because selector gives us the infrastructure to do go-to-related records to anywhere in our system, and because connector connects that up, we can use that anywhere, and then connector also gives us the ability to get to those unstored calcs that are stored in the back and forth table from anywhere in our system. All right, so another very common thing that we love to do are these picker kind of dealies, where we can type in a name and get some filtered list of, in this case, customers. And maybe we also want to do the same thing for items. So we have a picker for items here. Let's see if we got any other. No, nothing there. So we have so these are some items that we can pick. So pickers are really cool, and the way that I like to, there's a couple different ways I like to build pickers. One of which is to use a virtual list, and one of which is to just do it very, very simply, and I'm going to show both of those right here. So the first one is a virtual list. If you're not familiar with virtual list techniques, do an internet search for virtual list in FileMaker. You'll find lots of stuff about them. The important thing to know for our purposes here is that we, again, have our virtual lists. Here it is up here. It's connected. This is our infrastructure for virtual lists. It's connected to connector, which means that we can use virtual lists on any place that we're building our layouts or scripts. So that is that's really great. So we don't have to have different copies of the virtual list tables and infrastructure all over the place. And so that's what this one is. It's using virtual lists, and it's actually using SQL to do these queries. So sometimes if you've got a large number of records, really if you've got more than, say, a few hundred records in another table, and you want to build a picker like this with this kind of filtering, you're going to need to do something like SQL or some other method and use virtual list to do it. But it works quite well. So we have this virtual list picker built in here. We can use this. So this is a customer picker. You can imagine that if the system was bigger, maybe we were doing purchase orders and returns and things like that, we could pick customers or contacts using the exact same code, the exact same popover that I just showed there from anywhere. And again, because it's all connected through connector, through the virtual list, this is the graph that we need, then it'll work. It'll work from anywhere. So that's pretty cool. However, what's even easier is in a case like this. In this case, we're just picking the number. We're picking from items, and in the items table in this situation, we only have, I think, let's see, items has. Well, let's just go over to items and see how many records there are on items. So items only has 110 records. So in this case, as a demo, I wanted to show another sort of super simple way of doing a picker, and that is by let's look at the picker item itself here. Notice down here, let's close that. Notice down here, we're just showing a portal to items. So we're going from wherever we happen to be, orders, to items. And if we look at the graph, we can see that that is done through from here to connector and back to items. But since these are both cross joins, by default, this is going to show all the items, and you can pick that way. But if you wanted to add a filter, you could do that really simply by just filtering the portal, which is what I'm doing here. And I have put a, I've got a global field that we're entering the data into, and we're filtering against the name of the item. And if it's true, it returns it, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. And that works just fine. So in the case where I don't have a lot of, when I don't have a lot of records in the table I'm picking from, building a picker with just using that cross join from orders to items works just great. And again, because everything's connected, the graph is all tied together like that. That same picker could work on purchase orders or returns or whatever. It's going to work exactly the same. So that is a look at pickers. Now, I guess before I shut down on that, let me talk about a related something we're using here that's also kind of falls out when we have this connector in place. If we look at, not that, I want to look at the picker filter field, you can see that it is in a table called orders utility. Now that's a global, and so it can really be accessed from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. But what this brings up is what I've started doing in this pattern is I've started to create, I've started to use lots of different sort of utility table occurrences. And these are just used to kind of namespace and divide up the code that normally might be packed all into one big globals TTO, like we used to do in the old days. But I think that part of the reason we used to do that, at least for me, is because prior to FileMaker 7, we'd only had 50 tables. We couldn't make tables just to namespace something to give us a way to organize our fields. We had to put everything into 50 tables. So just about every major complex solution I ever saw had one file with one table in it, and it's all you could do is one table and one file, dedicated to hundreds and maybe even thousands of global fields. So, but tables are cheap, and not necessarily TOs, but single record tables or global only tables are very cheap. And in this case, by having an orders utility, I can move all those kinds of global fields or other fields that don't necessarily need to be in my orders table. I can put them in this orders utility TO. And if they're unstored calcs, I can even access those by connecting it, once again, through connector to the other tables. So I don't need to dirty up my data table as much by putting global fields in there that I wouldn't need to. I can put them in utility tables. So utility tables that are connected through the connector become very, very useful, and is another example of one of those things that just gets easier once you have a connector in place. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a fairly advanced topic, transactions. And if you don't know what database transactions are, what FileMaker's, how FileMaker does database transactions, take a look at my website. We'll include some links in the post that will help you with that. We've got lots of good information and other videos you can watch on transactions. But the big thing, important thing to know about transactions is that they are the best and most robust way of ensuring that the changes you make to your database with a script actually happen completely, or they don't happen at all, and that tends to be a really good thing. So in the case we're going to look at, we're going to imagine a simple inventory type scenario where we have an order here, and we're going to post that order to inventory. And what that means is we're going to update the order quantity field in the item record that's associated with this order. We're going to update it by 1 in this case. That's the amount that's on this order. We've got this item here. I've got that same item over here kind of blown up big so we can keep an eye on the ordered quantity field in the background there. So right now there's been no items have been ordered, but once we post it, we're going to toggle with this button here. We've now got an item quantity of 1 over here on this side. And this is just a regular field. This is not a calculation. That's looking at the sum of related records, because that would be far too slow in any real scenario. So in this case, what we're doing is we are looping through the records in the portal here, and we're updating the item record for each item that we find in the order items table. So if you can imagine what that looks like, let's take a look at our graph. So down here, we're on orders, and here's order items. So we're going to loop through the order items, and we're going to update the order items, the inventory item, or the item record that's associated with each one of these order items. But we don't have to have a table occurrence for items hanging off of here, which is the way we would do this without Selector Connector. We don't need that. We can actually go through our selector. So we loop through orders, we get the item ID for whatever order item we're on, we set it into our selector table here to item ID. That gives us access to the selected item. So we can, without having to have a special items TO down here, we can connect to and update the item record that's associated with this order item without having to leave. So that turns out to be really, really useful because I can update and edit and delete records all over my system without having to leave the layout. When I don't leave the layout, that means I'm still inside of a single transaction, which means I can roll it back if there's some problem. And that's how transactions work. Having this selector in here makes it easy for us to be able to include any records that we want to create, edit, update, and delete in our system by just working through the selector. And of course, the selector is connected to everything through the connector. So selector gives us the ability to do in-place transactional scripting right within FileMaker. And that's what we're going to do here. Let's see how that would work. So we posted it, but now here's the problem. Let's say somebody comes along and they lock this record by editing it. So now that record is locked and open, and I decide I want to unpost this or take this, sort of undo what I just did. If I didn't have a really good way of managing that, this could be a problem because this record would be unavailable for editing. So if I click this button, what happens? Well, we get an error saying record in use by another user, and nothing happened, which is exactly what we would hope. So the record is still flagged as posted, and we haven't done anything over here. So if I revert this record, it's back. It's back at 1. But again, the deal is that when I'm posting, I need to update two things. I need to update this record to say that this inventory item this order is posted, and I would need to update every item in this portal. I need to update its associated item record to reflect that status as well. So being able to do this in a transaction-safe way is really, really important, and I can by doing this. So we post it, somebody comes in here and they start to edit this record, they do something, now that record is locked, and if somebody else tries to unpost, they're safely told that they can't do this right now because the record is in use. So that's just an example of what we call in-place transactions, which is a really, really powerful feature that lets us do very robust transaction-safe scripting from anywhere in our system by using this selector connector model. So the key thing, the wrap-up on this, and what this is really talking about, is what selector gives you the ability to do is to create, edit, and update any record in any table that you attach to it over here. And you can do that from anywhere that you are in your graph that you're working on layouts and scripts, etc., from over here, because it all goes through connector and through selector. So that makes it possible to do just about anything from anywhere in your layout. If you want to delete records, like if I want to delete a selected customer or a selected item, I am going to need to have a portal on the layout. Like if I want to delete a customer from an orders and I'm over here, I'm going to need to have a portal to selected customer on my layout. And that's just because the only way to delete a record without going to that record in a layout is through a portal. So you have to put a portal on the layout to do that. But other than that, I can select records, I can create records, and I can edit records all without leaving where I am. So that is the power of in-place transactions and the power of selector. That's about it. All right, so that was a look at Selector Connector and some of the examples and things that get really easy when you have this model in place. And so we're just going to run through sort of a recap of that. So one of the things I really like about this is that your graph pieces are more modular. So you have a graph that is separated out by functionality and feature in a really nice way. It makes it easy to know what parts of the graph belong with what features. It's drier, so we have less code duplication due to different contexts because we're able to reuse a lot of our table occurrences from different parts of the graph. Less side effects, so if we don't have to leave where we are, we get there's these side effects associated with leaving the layout. We get records committed when we may not want them to if we're in the middle of a transaction. We don't reset tabs, script triggers aren't firing, all those things don't happen if we stay right where we are instead of having to go jump around. And then we looked at a bunch of things that got easier once we sort of had this model in place. You can do virtual lists are pretty easy. Master detail gets easier. Graphics are cake. Pickers, utility tables are this nice thing you can do. We saw menus, and we also took a look at how we can do transactions really easily, all within this model. So recapping, connector is a single record that has to be all global. So it's a single record, all globals in that table. It's connected via cross joins to all of the major pieces of your graph, and there are no layouts created on connector. That's really important. We don't want that. Selector is basically the same thing, but it is used instead of connecting everything, it is used to select everything. So with the selector, you can select any record in any table that you want, and you can edit it, you can create new records, you can update the data, and you can even delete the data. One caveat is you will need to be able to refresh the X-join from time to time, and we have a single script in the demo file which can do that. It's just like having to refresh the window occasionally. You will need to kick those X-joins, those cross-joins, and make them work. So that's about it. That is Selector Connector, and well, that's about it. Thanks very much.